what's the time?
It's time to get ill.
And what's the time?
It's time to get ill.
So what's the time?
It's time to get ill.
Now what's the time?
It's time to get ill.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Illiteracy Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Benson, a senior policy analyst at the Heartland Institute, a national free market think tank. This is the first time we are doing a video podcast. The powers that be at Heartland wanted me to start doing this a video as well, because some of you crazy people like to watch these things instead of just listen to them, which is your right. So for those of you who are more visually inclined, we're doing you a solid now and doing these on video, so you can watch us on YouTube or wherever you guys watch your videos. But anyway, so this podcast, for those of you just tuning in for the first time, if you haven't tuned into the audio podcast before, basically what we do here on the podcast is I invite an author on to discuss a book of theirs that's been newly published or recently published on somebody, someone, some event, some idea, something, et cetera, that we think you guys would like to hear a conversation about. And then hopefully at the end of the podcast, you go ahead and give the book a purchase and give it a read. So if you like this podcast, please consider giving Illiteracy a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to the show, and also by sharing with your friends, as that's the best way to support programming like this. And my guest today, returning guest, is Dr. Daniel J. Mahoney. And Dr. Mahoney is a professor emeritus at Assumption University, a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute for the study of statesmanship and political philosophy, and a senior writer at Law and Liberty, which is one of my favorite websites. He is the author of close to, 1 billion books at this point, including...
12 or 13 books and another 10 or so edited. So
there you go. Yeah. So among those are The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order, The Idol of Our Age, How the Religion of Humanity Subverts Christianity, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology, and The Statesman as Thinker, Portraits of Greatness, Courage, and Moderation, for which he was previously a guest on this podcast and for which he won the 2023 Paolucci Prize for Conservative Book of the Year from ISI. And he is here today to chat about his latest book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now, which was published back in April by Encounter Books. So, Dr. Mahoney, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. I do appreciate it.
Great pleasure to be here, Tim.
Well, thank you. All right. So the normal entry question, how did this project come about? And then I guess just explain to people what it is you mean by the ideological lie.
All right. I'll tell you, with my books, I always find I'm writing them even before it's a process by which I'm engaged with a subject or a theme or an author. My mind is oriented in that direction. And then about a third of the way into the process, I realize I'm writing a book. And I think this book fit that pattern very much. And for a long time, I had been making the argument that we in the West, what we used to call the West, the Western democracies, had learned very little from the experience of ideological politics in the 20th century, really going back to the French Revolution, that the ideological subversion of politics always has the same structure, a kind of contempt for the common sense and self-government of ordinary people, a dangerous deference to the abstractions, to the abstractions of the intellectual class, of pseudo experts, etc., and also, most importantly, a replacement of the old common sense distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, better and worse, with a with a very pernicious distinction between progress and reaction. Notice with progressive politics today, you never say, or people very seldom say, you're wrong. They simply say, you're not on the train. These are reactionary views. These are outdated views and all of that. And that's a way of stigmatizing people by and refusing to address arguments. Empirical arguments, rational arguments are just dismissed because they're not in accord with the most fashionable ideological nostrums. And that's related, by the way, I think all of that, this process of refusing to posit the legitimacy of resistance to progressive and abstract ideological schemes has been going on for an awful long time. But we saw it come to a head in an almost self-parodic way in the summer of 2020, with a cult of intellectual wokeness that was destroying the intellectual life, that had colonized our universities. It has many manifestations, a kind of green utopianism that simply ignores the empirical dimensions of those questions, an indulgence toward totalitarian ideologies. Who would have thought in 2020 or 2025 we would have a disproportionate number of young people, and generally people on the left liberal end of the spectrum, who have a positive evaluation not only of socialism but of communism. We did very little to pass on knowledge of the criminality, the unprecedented despotism that characterized really existing socialism, as they called it in the East during the 20th century, and on and on and on. And I certainly noticed, as many others did, this kind of this new fanaticism, this desire to cancel the personhood of those who weren't ready to go, jump on the progressivist train. And so I see all of these things I've been talking about as manifestations of the persistence of the ideological lie. The subtitle of the book is The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now. I did not mean to suggest that the United States had been transformed into a totalitarian country, although there were powerful impulses at work that aimed to shut down conversation, to ban points of view that were perfectly reasonable but were not acceptable to the progressivist consensus. Universities became, Chester Finn, a conservative educational expert, once called the modern university a sea of repression, an island of repression in a sea of freedom. Of course, by 2020, the people who were coming out of the universities were colonizing civil society, and, started having, the women in the New York Times editorial room, and they were mainly women, talking like Maoists, An explicitly Maoist organization, BLM, was celebrated for its anti-racism, when in fact it's an organization committed to a kind of unprecedented racialism, a racial obsessionism, worthy of the fascists and the Nazis. But persistent ideological lie, I don't mean that politicians lie. Many politicians fib or tell half-truths or say what's convenient or contradict themselves with abandon. I mean a lie in a much more fundamental and radical sense. And that lie, it's linked to this displacement of common sense distinction between truth and falsehood and good and evil, with the ideological distinction between progress and reaction. But it's tied toward a radical spirit of utopian social engineering. It's the idea that the human condition can be radically transformed, that political and social problems can be solved a 20th century political philosopher, a Frenchman named Bertrand de Juvenel, once spoke about the myth of the solution. Most social problems can be settled. We can address them. We have, powers of ameliorism. Environmentalism is a very good example of that. But the effort for some cosmic solution, we change the whole of human life to address a problem that is, in many ways, ideologically defined. You're dealing with something different. You're dealing with a lie. You're dealing with a fundamental distortion of reality, and that distortion is linked to a view that we can fundamentally change the nature of man and the nature of society. So even after the end of the explicit totalitarian experiences of the 20th century.
Mm-hmm. And you brought up the sort of woke explosion in our country about a half decade ago, or a half decade ago right now. And you were talking about the campuses, and I remember when the woke thing, which is really just like a metastasized version of the whole political correctness, when all this stuff started bubbling up on college campuses, especially what are considered elite college campuses, where all these students were having these like freakouts over Halloween costumes or trigger warnings and all that sort of stuff. And when it started getting play in the media, everyone was sort of like, well, that's fine that these kids do this now, but that's not the real world. And once they get out of college, they're gonna be in for a rude awakening. But what we found is that this thing had escaped the lab, so to say, of the American elite university, and then just sort of almost like an epidemic, just sort of infected everything. So how did this woke despotism that you call it, this woke spirit, how did it infiltrate all the commanding heights of American society? I mean, not just media, but corporate boardrooms and politics and what have you. How did that happen?
Well, Christopher Rufo has argued, I think, very persuasively that this ideological virus, this sort of contamination of independent civil society and corruption of our politics, it became so overwhelmingly noticeable in 2020. But the story really goes back to the 1960s.
Right, yeah.
When universities decided to side with the least wise, least discerning, most ideologically progressive elements in our intellectual life. And for a very, very long time, I was an undergraduate at the College of the Holy Cross, a Jesuit university in Worcester, Massachusetts. And in 1979 or 80 or so, Alger Hiss, the traitor, the Soviet spy, did immense damage to our country, came to campus. I was the only one who challenged him out of an audience of 500. That was 1970. I will tell you, conservatives would win elections. Herbert Kohl in West Germany, Margaret Thatcher in 79 in Great Britain, Ronald Reagan in 1980. And yet the radicalization of the university, of the culture, of the elites would continue. Proceed apace. And I must say, a lot of people on the center right were blind to this because precisely for what you read. They thought, well, this isn't the real world. And I think there was an anti-intellectualism, underestimating the power of ideas, however perverse and corrupt, that people would come out and be normalized by the real world. But the real world started become deeply um, informed by ideological categories. We could see it with race. HR departments going back to the 80s and 90s became
Mhm.
vehicles for the most censorious kind of racialism and all these things, the roots of DEI, the roots of radical environmentalism, a very one-sided account of the relations between men and women, the obligatory genuflection before abortion on demand. You know, the pro-life movement is completely dominated by women. Not all women are radical feminists, but you wouldn't know that. It's not an endorsement or a criticism, but Phyllis Schlafly's Equal Forum had like 35 times the membership of the National Endowment of Women. Would one know that from reading the New York Times or the Washington Post or listening to the political class? And Andrew Sullivan, who's a complicated figure politically, I think he always votes for the left while criticizing. But he famously said in 2020, we're all living.
Right. Yeah.
Barry Weiss, who's sort of unclassifiable politically, but she's certainly a very notable and eloquent critic of wokeness. She's now the news director for CBS News, which is just unbelievable.
Yeah. I'd love to see those New York Times Slack channel discussions about that now.
But anyway, I mentioned Barry because Barry, who was kicked out, she was the ombudsman at the New York Times in 2020, and when she was criticizing the movement's sort of revolutionary turn, she was treated to the worst vitriol, condemnation, and name calling by the people in the New York Times newsroom and editorial offices. They were radicalized. Many of them that were not. I don't think people who studied economics or history. They had majored in those ideological majors. The ones that the studies majors. Where you're trained to be an ideologist. Your whole approach to social issues, to policy, to politics, to human life is what I call in the book the tyranny of the ideological cliche. Let's not forget the law schools.
Yeah.
Derek Bell, beginning in the 60s, a kind of racialism, a kind of hatred. By the way, I don't like the language of whiteness because I don't like white identity politics. I think it's a really stupid reaction to other kinds of ideological politics. But it was an inevitable thing once identity politics stigmatized all non-minorities as evildoers beyond redemption. So all of this, and the anti-communist, the European Revolution of 1989, the collapse of totalitarian communism, you would have thought we would have learned some lessons from that. As far as I can tell, I just read a conference at the University of Texas with Harrison Morrison and Flag Taylor on teaching about communist tyranny and criminality to the new generation. They know nothing. Of course, this all should have been done a very long time ago, but better late than never. So it's a long process, but I think the center right is elicited by the anti-intellectual economism. Everyone will go out the real world, all will be well, and also by the failure to take seriously our ideas, however correct, however intellectual.
All right, so I guess the next question then, going back to the totalitarian impulse and the ideological lie and that whole thesis of the book. So how does totalitarian ideology negate conscience?
Well, I mean, I might even begin by saying that totalitarian ideology involves the denial of the reality and the efficacy of human conscience. I think one of the most powerful signs we have that we live in a moral universe is the reality of conscience, that we have this inner voice. Um, St. Paul, it doesn't have to be a religious believer, says there's a law written in the hearts of men, Romans 2:15. Thomas Aquinas called it the natural law. Some of the more secular thinkers of the 18th century, like Adam Smith, who was half secular, called it the moral sense. Abraham Lincoln spoke that way about chattel slavery, that, why didn't the children of free men in the South allow their children to play with the children of slave owners? And he said they didn't because they knew in their heart of hearts that slavery was a moral abomination. Okay, I think what communism did, and the same of Nazism, it subverted that natural moral sense or that natural moral conscience, told us to ignore it in the name of a liberating and transformative ideology whose goal was to radically engineer human nature and the world. Solzhenitsyn has a wonderful and very memorable passage in Volume 1 of his great anti-totalitarian classic, The Gulag Archipelago, where he says Shakespeare's evildoers stopped at a half a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Now, Macbeth is able to kill Duncan and his family and engage in this hideous overreaching of becoming a murderous tyrant, because he puts his conscience to the side. But the really interesting thing is, I think Solzhenitsyn's point is that if you've read Shakespeare's Macbeth, Macbeth did have a conscience, and
drives him crazy.
And it drives him crazy. Even Lady Macbeth, Lady Macbeth at the beginning of the play, she's the one who's encouraging Macbeth to engage in this usurpation. She gives us a very memorable and dark soliloquy about wanting the milk in her breast to dry up, and she says, "Unsex me."
Yes.
Yeah. But at the end, she's the one who's desperately trying to get the blood out of her robe. Yeah, and she's on. But ideology is the thing that literally allows you to overcome your conscience. What you're doing is not a horrible act that violates your moral integrity, that is at odds with our natural moral sense. Ideology, these are necessary means to achieve perpetual political progress, to change human nature, to use the language of Robespierre in the French Revolution, to regenerate the human race. And so ideology, it has many facets and features, but I would say one of its most striking characteristics is it has to neuter, undermine, destroy moral conscience for people to think that the terrible crimes, the tyrannical politics, the social engineering, the deprivation of life and liberty are somehow legitimate. And they're only legitimate when the primordial distinctions that we all know in a commonsensical way, the distinctions between the true and the false and good and evil, are replaced by that deeply pernicious distinction between progress and reaction. And related to this, and this is a really major theme of my book, the common sense view that we find in the classics like Plato and Aristotle, Cicero, we find in the moderate Enlightenment thinkers like Adam Smith, Hume, Montesquieu, the American founders, we find in Jewish Christian thinking, is that evil is never localized. You can't just say, the Jews are the source of evil, or the bourgeoisie is the source of evil, or evil white men are the source of evil. you have to recognize that all of us have a capacity to misuse our freedom, to excuse our depredations. And all of us, when giving unlimited power, are quite capable of being tyrants. That was sort of the glory of the American founding. They knew that men were not angels.
Right.
Because of the non-angelic character of human nature, we needed a government to control men, but because of the non-angelic character of the governors, we needed constitutional mechanisms to control the governed.
Right.
I quote a political scientist, a very fine political scientist of another generation, Martin Diamond, who said the American Revolution, unlike the French, unlike the Soviet, unlike the Nazi, was a very unique, very paradoxical revolution. It was an anti-utopian revolution. It was a revolution of sober expectations.
Yeah, it wasn't trying to completely rearrange society from top to bottom, and it was more of a reactionary revolution, or these guys were just saying, look, we just want our basic rights as Englishmen respected. These things that already exist, like, we just want that to start. And the French Revolution.
And by the way, that's how I would say the American Revolution began exactly as you described. The intolerable acts when the British Crown is basically, they're trying to get more resources after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and they end a 150-year policy of benign neglect toward the colonies.
Salutary neglect, right? Isn't that the...
Yes, salutary neglect was replaced by very heavy-handed policies. And as Edmund Burke wrote in his speech on Conciliation of America in 1775, the Americans were good Englishmen. They loved liberty. They loved their traditional liberties. I do think what the Declaration of Independence does, it takes those rights of Englishmen and it says they're inherent natural rights.
Universal,
They're universal, but it does so in a way that builds on a long experience of civic and political liberty in the colonies. So it's the revolution, you might say, has a traditional base. And by the way, the best way, the most immediate way to get at the difference between the American and French Revolution, besides the French Revolution valorizing terror as an instrument of state and positing utopian ends, the regeneration of the human race, etc. And also look at liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity is a very good thing, but not when it's coerced and imposed by the government. In America, we never called each other's citoyen, like the French, as an ideological title. And
it's like comrade,
Yeah, like comrade. That's right.
Yeah.
And you can bet there's no authentic, non-coerced, non-ideologically brotherhood when you're forced to call each other brothers, right?
Right.
So that's America. The other thing is, it is true that the American founders occasionally spoke of things like a new order of the ages. But what they meant was not a utopian transformation of the human condition. What they meant was the capacity of free and lawful men to govern themselves, an experiment in republican government. A republic, if we can keep it, as John Adams said.
Right.
All right. But the French revolutionaries started a revolutionary calendar. The cessation of the monarchy, which took a couple of years, but once you execute the king and queen, you establish a republic. That's year zero. You have 13 months. You have 10 days in the week. You abolish the Christian Sabbath. You replace it with a fake day of revolutionary festivities. I mean, when you study French revolutionary history, it's very perplexing because of the calendar. Robespierre was finally, because the revolution had begun to devour itself, he was arrested and executed on the 9th of Thermidor in the year 2.
Right.
Which, for those of you who haven't learned the revolutionary calendar, that was July 7th, 1794. But Marx spoke of everything before communism or the communist revolution as the prehistory of humanity. That's like saying, he even used the image, kind of a Darwin-inspired image, that human beings to date, before the coming of revolutionary communism, we were like the great apes compared to human beings. We were earlier forms of primate. So the story of mankind had not yet begun. And that way of thinking is, the political philosopher Eric Voegelin said, it's just cut off from reality. It's imposing a second reality, a fake reality, onto human experience. And I think another way of thinking about ideological mode of thinking, or the ideological lie, is, instead of starting within social practices, lived experience, you have these ideological abstractions that are highly visionary, highly utopian, that don't really cohere with human nature. And then you impose them on the real world. And then people are living in this world where they have, by the way, it wasn't as bad in the United States, but in some elite institutions, you had to listen to and learn a new language that really didn't cohere with common sense and ordinary experience. Look at all these fake academic fields where they write in perpetual jargon.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, since we're on the French Revolution, and you brought up Robespierre, and his timely passing in the month of Thermidor, how do the paradoxes of Robespierre sort of reveal the paradoxes that remain at the heart of this deformed version of modernity that is present in that totalitarian sort of ideology?
Well, that's a very good question, a very fine question. There were certainly some American founders who wanted to believe that the French Revolution would just be a continuation of the American Revolution. They felt obliged to sympathize with it and support it. Jefferson was that way. I mean, he was turned off by the terror, but still, they're on our side, that kind of thing. That was not the view of three of the greatest of our founders: George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. All three of them were repulsed by any suggestion that the French Revolution was, in effect, part of the same process as the American Revolution. Hamilton wrote an essay to himself, it's in his collected works, on the French Revolution, just to clarify his thoughts. And he said, do not identify our two revolutions. He said the French Revolution was put forward by fanatics in political science. They had no sense of limits. They had no sense of moral and constitutional restraints. And they had abiding contempt for the Christian religion. Remember, Robespierre establishes a new cult of the supreme being. They turn the Cathédrale de Notre Dame Cathedral, into a pagan ideological temple. They take over the Catholic Church with the secular constitution of the clergy. And anyone who didn't accept, a lot of like what communist countries did to the churches, they put them under draconian control and made bishops and priests parrot revolutionary and ideological slogans. What's completely missing in Robespierre is any sense that power needs to be limited because of imperfect human nature. What's missing in Robespierre is any sense that there are limits to what the revolutionary order can do, a realm of privacy where religion ought to be free, where men's consciences ought to be free. Edmund Burke famously said, the French Revolution was the first complete revolution, that it aimed to go to the very insides of the human mind. And Robespierre, in a famous speech in 1794, says there's an intimate and necessary connection between virtue and terror. And without terror, virtue risks becoming ineffectual. He says without virtue, terror, well, might end up becoming more terroristic. But he was one of the first statesman thinkers to validate, not only to validate, but to put forward terror as a sublime instrument of politics and state policy. The other thing about Robespierre is he's a type. Lenin was a bit like this. Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the CHK, the Soviet secret police, a former Polish Catholic seminarian, gave up the old religion and became a fanatic of the new religion, of a secular ideology that had thrown out conscience, moral sense, the moral law. And these guys were aesthetes in a way. They lived and died for the revolution. They weren't like corrupt, 1950s Soviet apparatchiks living at their dachas. They would sacrifice everything for the transformation of the world. Robespierre was famously called by his contemporaries the incorruptible.
Right, yeah.
There's no evidence he ever had sex with a woman. He didn't have time for that, There was a revolution to make. There were eggs to be broken to make the revolutionary omelet. But the other really interesting thing, Tim, is that before he became head of the Committee on Public Safety and under the old regime, he was a lawyer in Arras, and he was against the death penalty. It was cruel. And the really interesting thing about Robespierre and Saint-Just and his other terrorist collaborators, as Burke also noticed, they used the language of humanity. We need more humane social policy. They attacked the old regime as cruel and unjust. And yet they were far more cruel and unjust than the system they replaced. Because once they had absolute power, it was necessary to unleash mass terror in order to lead to a society where liberty, equality, and fraternity were wholly instantiated, and where the enemies of the people, the true sources of wickedness, were either arrested or killed. So it's all there, the ideological syndrome, and Robespierre thought he was a benefactor of humankind. Paul Johnson wrote a book about 20 years ago called The Intellectuals, maybe 25 years ago.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah, it's a great book. He looks at a modern type, and that modern type can be summed up in a single sentence. They're the people who love humanity but despise.
Right.
And Robespierre is the quintessence of that human and political type.
Yeah, very true. All right. You also brought up Marx just a bit ago, and you had a great line in one of the essays, because the book is basically a collection of essays, but all sharing the same sort of theme. And you said that,
and very much crafted to be a unitary book. Yeah.
Right. Yes. Right.
But
right.
you can with value read any individual chapter. But if you want to see the theme of the ideological lie develop, then you really should read from beginning to end.
Right. So you said that basically that Leninism, Stalinism is the effectual truth of the Marxism of Marx, whether Karl Marx intended it to be or not. That we always hear from the communists and the socialists that the Leninism and especially Stalinism are these sort of bastardizations of Marx's philosophy and Marx's teaching, and that they're not true socialism, and true socialism's never been actually done. But you're saying that's not the case. That that Leninism, Stalinism is the natural outgrowth of Marxist thought, Marxist thinking.
Absolutely. And by the way, that rhetorical strategy, and it had two forms. Lenin corrupted Marx. Certain Marxist socialists did believe that. Not many, but some did. And then there was the Stalin betrayed Marx and Lenin. And by the way, that was a real easy cop-out, because if the aberration in the Soviet Union or in other totalitarian communist countries is due to one human being, then Marxism itself is unaffected by really existing socialism. And so I always get a little nervous when people say the Stalinist gulag or Stalinist crimes, because as Alexander Solzhenitsyn points out in the Gulag Archipelago, the camp system, the secret police, the repression of independent intellectuals, the murder of priests and bishops, the suppression of the independent peasantry, the arrest of the bourgeoisie, the merchants, the men of commerce, that all began within weeks and months of the beginning of the revolution. So, and Lenin himself was inspired by the Marxist call. I treated at a little length in my chapter on Marx. I said, if you really want to get to the totalitarian, utopian core of the Marxism of Marx wrote a big, variegated work. I mean, I suppose one could wade through Capital 1 and Capital 3, but I don't
recommend it.
I don't recommend it. Yeah, you're right. But the four abolitions, as I call them, in part 2 of the Communist Manifesto. And by the way, it was Marx who first used the term dictatorship of the proletariat in a letter in 1852. It was Marx who outlines a 10-point progress of revolutionary centralization and tyranny at the end of part 2 of the manifesto. But the four abolitions are the abolition of private property. Marx writes, communism can be summed up in a single sentence: the abolition of private property. Then there's the abolition of the family, the bourgeois family. The abolition of religion, and the abolition of the nation. Well, my view is that all four of those social institutions and goods, they have a certain plasticity or flexibility in how they're applied historically, but they're all natural. It's very difficult to imagine a recognizably human social order without private property, certainly one that's not tyrannical and oppressive, without some recognition of a religious horizon above the will to power of human beings. The family, the abolition of the family, I think we know to be nightmarish. All utopian schemes to replace the family with, some kind of collectivist arrangement have the immediate character of a nightmare. And the nation, and by the way, not just the nation, but any particular political forms, that we live in concrete political communities. And the Marxist goal was always a universal homogeneous state, meaning the whole world would become part of a kind of socialist empire. The paradox is Marx and Lenin. Marx at the end of part 2 of the Communist Manifesto. Lenin in his 1917 essay just months before the revolution. He published it called The State and Revolution. They both advocate an unprecedented concentration of power to deal with the enemies of the people, to crush the bourgeois machinery of coercion. By the way, the bourgeois state in 1917 was not some horrible coercive mechanism. Russia was considered a barbaric state because you needed a passport to get in and out of it in 1910. You know, and the only government official that before, national income taxes that a typical Englishman saw was the postman, or maybe the vicar.
Right. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so government was pretty small. And so anyway, the idea that you can have an unprecedented centralization of polity, economy, society. You can go at enemies of the people. You can crush the religious minded. And then somehow, since evil is located in all those institutions, once you do that, in the famous language of Karl Marx, the state will wither away. Max Weber, writing in 1918, says when you do those things, you create a totalitarian state, and given imperfect human nature linked to ideological fanaticism, that stuff will never wither away. And I think we know enough about human nature and human historical experience to know that even though Marx, if you read Marx or Lenin, they're constantly denouncing the more humane, moderate socialists,
right,
as utopians. But what's more utopian than that? The belief that you can have a historically unprecedented concentration of power in imperfect men and expect it all to end in a kind of anarchical bliss. And so what I say in the chapter on Marx is that Leninist tyranny and Stalinist terror are perfectly legitimate outcomes of the premises of the Marxism of Marx. Everyone said, what about Trotsky? Trotsky's complaint about Stalin was that he was going too slow. He wasn't terroristic enough at home.
right.
He wasn't revolutionary enough abroad.
Right. Until he ended up with an ice pick in his back. But
in Mexico City.
Yeah. All right. We've already gone. Almost 50 minutes. So a couple more questions and then I'll.
How long have we gone on for?
47 minutes already.
Oh, time goes by when you're having fun.
Yeah, I know, right? So a couple more questions for you before we get you out the door. So you have a chapter on what he says the lost promise of 1989, and the events of 1989 were basically the end of a 200-year cycle of total revolution that was inaugurated by the French Revolution, and that the events of 1989, all of these countries in Eastern Europe that were sort of liberating themselves from Soviet oppression, and then you have events like Tiananmen Square and elsewhere. These were all a decisive repudiation of the ideological lie. But how did we squander the promise of that year, which is, 35 years ago now?
Oh, it's a wonderful question. And you're absolutely right to point out that I regard that as a truly lost opportunity. First of all, what one saw in 1989, and it happened in a series of countries, hundreds of thousands of people fleeing East Germany through Hungary, the Hungarians in the fall of 89 explicitly repudiating communism and rehabilitating the courageous freedom fighters, the Hungarian Revolution of 59. There was an election for the Polish Senate. The government finally allows a real election, and Solidarity won 100 of the 100 seats. But not like in a communist election where they only would win one, but get 100 seats. Nobody voted for the communists.
Right.
And Yeah, and it ends the worst of the European dictators, Ceausescu. Um, it was bliss to be alive.
Yeah, Merry Christmas to Ceausescu.
Yeah, he's on the palace. He's speaking the language of war, the ideologically wooden language. The revolution goes on, and the crowd yelled back, "No!" And 4 or 5 days, he and his wife were killed. Well, it was very exciting when Václav Havel was sworn in. He had been a political prisoner 4 times in the 1780s, and a veteran anti-communist, and he's the president of Czechoslovakia on January 1st, 1990. I cannot tell you how dramatic. This was as dramatic as the opening months of the French Revolution in 1789. But we never really drew any conclusions from this. I would say that Havel liked to say that the defeat of communism was a victory for liberty and human dignity. And it was, of course, a repudiation of ideological mendacity. Mendacity, of course, just being a fancier word for lies. But in the West, we said, oh, capitalism defeated communism, which was true, but a very low-level, superficial. Yes, societies cannot work without markets, and that would have been part of a more fundamental. But what happens when you try to engineer the human soul? What happens when you war with human creativity and individuality? What happens when you give a ideological justification of the confiscation of political liberty, when people have to speak publicly in the language of newspeak and doublespeak, to use the still pertinent categories of George Orwell? We never thought about any of that. And, it's funny. I don't know how old you are, Tim. I think considerably younger than me, but I would say
43.
43. Okay, so you were a boy.
Yeah, but I mean, I do remember in late 1989 when, like, seeing the Berlin Wall come down on TV. And I still have, actually, the first time I went to Berlin, I have a piece of it somewhere.
Great. A lot that people did that, and it was a smart thing to do because it's a piece of human history. So President George W. Bush, a perfectly honorable man, when he was asked what his comment was about the fall of the wall. And by the way, I had tears in my eyes on November 9th, 1989, because I went into class the next day. I was teaching a course on Soviet politics, and I said, it wasn't it glorious what happened last night? It was a Friday, and none of the kids had heard about it because they were at the bars that night. And I looked at them, and I learned a long time ago, never yell at students, but you can poke fun of them. And I said, guys, you're being a little pathetic. You're going to learn about the most dramatic events of the age in an adult education class when you're 55. They were drunk through the fall of the Berlin.
Oh, I mean, to be fair, there was no social media or cell phones or anything with it. So if you were out and there was no TV or radio, I mean, you were just,
and a lot of them were tuned out from politics. You're right. Yeah, no, you're right. But still, the fact that 40 students, none of them had heard about the collapse of the Berlin Wall was
no one read the paper in the morning, I guess.
No, that's really, I think, what it said. George Bush said it wouldn't be prudent to talk about it, wouldn't be prudent to comment on the. And they made fun of him when Saturday Night Live was still a little funny.
Yeah, Dana Carvey.
Dana Carvey made fun of him about that. There was, but it wasn't. We didn't need to gloat about the fall of communism. We needed to explain to our own citizens what this meant, what was at stake, and why. I have a friend, Sean McMeekin, who has a wonderful book out called he's a Russianist, who's written very intelligently on the politics.
Yeah, he's been on the show a couple times.
Okay, Sean.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
By the way, Sean is one of those people I call preternaturally articulate. He's a fast talker. He's very smart. He's got all the facts and figures, the history, the politics, the philosophy. He was with me at that the conference on teaching communism to the new generation. But his book is very strikingly called "The Rise and Fall and Rise of Communism." And the last rise has to do, I think, with two things: the increasing number of young people who think communism is a good thing. I used to say my students think communism is good in theory. In the 80s, I'd hear, but maybe not so good in practice. A lot of them think it's good in practice, too, because they know nothing of its history.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and they just haven't, they don't have the experience of living through it. And I mean, it just seems to be one of the flaws of human nature is that, lessons are forgotten very quickly until, that the Burke line, I think it's Burke, that, man will learn, so man is or experience is the teacher of mankind. He will learn by no other way, basically. And so these kids just, they don't remember it. They have no concept of it. I mean, but the people who did go through it certainly remember. Like a long time ago, I used to work on political campaigns, and this one congressional campaign I worked on, there was this girl who was connected. She was a volunteer. I forget how she was connected. I think she was like the fiance of the son of like a major donor to the campaign. And she was from Estonia. And her entire family came to visit from Estonia during the middle of this election, came down here to Florida for vacation to visit her. Must have been like, I don't know, 10 or 12 of them. And they all wanted to volunteer for the campaign while they were there, because it obviously was a Republican congressional campaign. And they wanted to campaign for the Republican because Republicans are the party of Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan was the one, that stood up to the Soviets and, precipitated their freedom as they saw it. So they were all, gung ho, all these Estonians that couldn't speak a word of English. I mean, so we basically just put them out, in the corner holding signs and stuff like that, because there's not much else they could do.
The Estonian Republican contingent.
Yeah.
The people in the East knew that the Republicans, one of the biggest cliches, mendacious cliches, was, well, we won the Cold War together. I think with Vietnam, the Democrats gave up on the Cold War. They became anti-communist. And so it was not a bipartisan effort in the last half of the Cold War. But yes, I mean, the people in the Eastern countries did better. But even there, in a country like Poland, in the 1990s, people didn't want to talk about it too much because it was too painful. But that said, we did nothing in this country. And the other thing, when McMeekin talks about the rise and fall in rights, he's also talking about what I'm talking about in The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, that many of these old patterns of thinking, castigating people who disagree with you as having, Leo Strauss called it the reductio ad Hitlerum.
Right,
Isn't it odd that so many people advocating, for positions that are quite humane, classical liberal, traditionally conservative, are castigated as fascist and either Nazis? I mean, it's a very, very strange phenomenon. And I can tell you, Tim, when I began teaching full time in 1986, it was a staple in my lectures to say, we have never experienced the kind of ideological politics that has torn France apart, divided Germany, led to nihilist totalitarian revolution in Russia. That in England and the United States, we had a broad political consensus, we had a center-left party and a center-right party, no big communist party, no big fascist or Nazi party. You can't really say that's the case anymore. Our parties have become more ideological. The left has become much more sympathetic to the totalitarian model, and the young are increasingly attracted to political ideologies and models that reveal themselves to be utterly destructive when in power. One of my favorite books is a book by two Russian emigres, beautiful dissection of totalitarian social engineering, and it's called Utopia in Power. The problem is, utopianism sounds like a bad idea, but when it comes to power, utopianism becomes totalitarian repression.
Mhm.
And that's what we have to remember.
All right. Okay. Well, like I said, it's already we're right on the hour mark, so that's as long as I said I'd keep you. I know you got other stuff to do.
Great.
So just end on the.
Did my voice get better?
Yeah. It sounded great. So
It did. So less muffling in these last 2/3.
yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
I don't know
Right.
what the issue was, but we are the mystery of these gadgets and machines.
Yeah. Our
Do you
overlords.
mainly do work in the environmental field? I know Heartland does a lot of that.
I don't do environment stuff. Okay, and one final question for you. You know, the normal exit question for everybody that comes on the show is, what would you like the audience to get out of this book? Or, what's the one thing you'd want a reader to take away from the book, having read it?
I would like the reader to appreciate that in some ways we're dealing with a kind of unprecedented assault on, our old constitutional order, the politics and morality of good sense. I hope to alert, not alarm, but alert readers to the fact that many of the old verities that we had long taken for granted have come under systematic assault, and that the republic's not going to stand if a critical mass in the new generations are taught to loathe their country, to loathe the market economy, who are not taught about the effectual truth about the murderous ideologies that dominated so much of the politics of the 20th century. So I want to wake people up, but I want to do it less in a polemical way, but in a way that brings all the resources of political history, political philosophy, and I hope a lot of learning to bear on the problem. So, and I hope that the reader of the book will be the readers of the book will be more sensitive to, it's not just mere jargon. These ideological abstractions can distort in a very radical and fundamental way our ability to see clearly, what's in front of us. What are the stakes of society? I like to say about this culture of repudiation: tear down, eliminate. I say to people on the center right, oppose it adamantly, but don't emulate it. We don't need a right-wing culture of repudiation. We don't need to throw out the baby with the bath. We're really dedicated to defending moderation, to core principles that provide the stable underpinning of human dignity in a free society. We have to fight back in a spirited and informed way, but we don't want to counter ideology, which ends up mimicking the ideological distortions of the very things we oppose. How's that?
All right. Very good. Well, once again, the name of the book is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie. A very nice cover from whoever the graphic artist was, the graphic designer in this.
I love the cover. It has there's a kind of George Orwell resonance to it.
Yeah. So the book is The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now, by Dr. Daniel J. Mahoney. It's a it's a shorter book, but a lot of food for thought in it. We went over an hour, and I didn't even, I don't even think I got to like half my questions. We didn't really get to talk about Dostoevsky or didn't really get to talk about Solzhenitsyn that much, or relativism, or a whole bunch of things. And 1619 Project, all kinds of stuff.
More stuff. Well, I did talk about the new racialism, but indirectly.
Yes.
But more goodies for the serious reader to discover.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So yeah, highly, highly recommend it for everybody out there. Pick up a copy for Christmas for the people that you love. Once again, the name of the book, The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, The Totalitarian Impulse Then and Now, by Dr. Daniel J. Mahoney. So Dr. Mahoney, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast to discuss the book with us. And, thank you for taking the time out of your life to actually write the sucker and get it out there for us so that we can enjoy the fruits of your labor.
Well, thank you, Tim. Really enjoyed having an opportunity to discuss the book with you today.
All right. Thank you. And again, if you like this podcast, please consider leaving us a 5-star review and sharing with your friends. And if you have any questions or comments or books you'd like to see discussed on the podcast, you can always reach out to me at tbenson@heartland.org. That's tbenson@heartland.org. And for more information about the Heartland Institute itself, you can just go to heartland.org. And that's pretty much it. So thanks for listening, or thanks for tuning in if you're watching this. And we'll see you guys next time. Take care. Love you, Robbie. Love you, Mom. Bye-bye.
If I could turn the page in time, then I'd rearrange just a day or two. Close my eyes, but I couldn't find a way, so I'll settle for one day to believe in you. Tell me lies. Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies. Tell me lies. Oh no, you can't disguise. Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies. Although I'm not making plans, I hope that you understand there's a reason why. Close your eyes. No more broken hearts. We're better off apart. Let's give it a try. Tell me lies. Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies. Tell me lies. Oh no, you can't disguise. Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies. If I could turn the page in time, then I'd rearrange just a day or two. Close my eyes, but I couldn't find a way, so I'll settle for one day to believe in you. Tell me lies. Tell me lies, tell me sweet little